Mop, mop. Clears my ribs.
Chris Morris was born in June 1962 in Colchester. He studied zoology at university and played bass guitar in bands before joining Radio Cambridgeshire in 1984. There he read the news and learned about the fundaments of editing before he got his own show. 3 years later, Chris moved to Radio Bristol, where he had a programme called No Known Cure. His biographer, Lucian Randall, explains.
That's where he pioneered a lot of things that he later took on to other shows. So the feedback reports, as he called them, where he'd go out on the street and just say to people, just weird things like...
What do you think of leaving it out?
Well, people should be able to leave it out if they want to, but there shouldn't be a charge on the community as a whole if they do so.
How long should they leave it out for?
Oh, I think if they should leave it out as long as they like. I mean, people should be entitled to live their own kind of life, but they shouldn't expect other people to look after them then.
Can you see any problems with leaving it out?
Oh, yes, I can, of course, because we have to live as a community.
What about leaving it out and then bringing it back in?
Oh, I think so. I think if you want to do that, yes, that's facing up to the responsibilities of being a citizen, I think.
And what about these people who leave it out and bring it back in so that people think they brought it back in and then put it out again when no one's looking?
Oh, well, no, I think at the end of the day you've got to make up your mind about this. Of course, it's a question of age and so on, isn't it?
24.
Oh, I would have thought so, something like that, mid-20s, yes.
And finally, what about the people who leave it out, bring it back, then go back and have a look at it?
No, I think we should forget about people like that.
One of his colleagues was later saying that he just had an unerring instinct for people who looked fuzzy enough in their own mind. I think he called it vague enough in their own mind to give the right answer, which is just you might not know, but you want to help.
Chris's feedback reports became a regular thing on No Known Cure and later at GLR, the BBC's local station for London. It was during his time at GLR that Chris met Sergeant Murphy, a trolley collector at his local supermarket who would respond to his feedback reports with a surrealism that mirrored his own.
Occasionally, every now and then, I allow my servant, Sergeant Murphy, to comment on matters which are provoking public interest. This was one of them last week.
Increased number of people around today rolling nuts about.
Well, I think it's disgraceful. A chap grabbed some nuts the other day and just kept rolling them along, smiling as he went by.
Been used to make noises.
A whole lot of noises. And the further it goes along, the more noise it gets. It's a propelling noise. I think it needs some eminent professor to come along and explain it.
Make them kneel.
Well, may not kneel, but to sort of bow down gracefully for long periods, say about 3/4 of an hour. And then to crumple up and make rather loud noises, almost a sighing, whimpering noise.
And then bounced horribly over high buildings.
Yes, off a height, yes. And a big bounce, a large bounce, and preferably a large bang at the end.
And laughing at them in a rather cruel way.
Yes, in a cruel way, snidey, down, low, callous type of laugh.
And once thus punished, they should wear what sort of tie?
Well, I think they should be made to wear a blue-green tie. A blue-green tie, tied tightly around the neck.
Horizontally sticking out in front of them.
Horizontally sticking out, yeah. Held up by a large nappy-type safety pin.
With a breaking strain?
Oh, about 150 pounds. That's extent. From the inside leg.
GLR was also where Chris distilled the art of the phone prank. He created fake radio personas like Wayne Carr and Peter Hamill to interview unsuspecting celebrities, such as Martin Lewis.
I'm Peter Hamill. Martin Lewis, welcome.
Thank you, Peter.
Now, Lewis is a name we associate with news quite a lot, isn't it? One thinks instinctively of Tony Lewis, the sportsman. Gavin Nestler's mother's maiden name was Lewis. Did you know that?
No, I didn't.
So, well, there's one
and
for you
and none of us are related.
Well, it's a strong newsy name. Of course, in America, there's Huey and his lot. But what about news? How does it help us?
How does news help us? I think it presents us with events and stories which help to make us more rounded, fuller people.
Well, how can we be sure that we haven't just watched a news bulletin which contained, say, a 290-degree news rather than a 360-degree one?
Well, I think you have to accept that what we decide to do is that we pick the top 12, 13, 14 stories of the day.
So it's very much like a sort of album chart.
How do you mean?
In that you have a prioritisation system.
Yes, of course we do. I mean, I think people do in most walks of life. I don't see anything unusual about having that in the news.
I suppose what you're saying is that the tape is always the same size.
The tape is always the same size.
It's not going to vary, is it?
In terms of the length, you're right. I mean,
The length of tape is the same size.
2.5 minutes, yes.
And obviously on a story about transport policy, you wouldn't go so far as to examine what a road was.
Well, when if a story is complex, then it helps to provide all the explanation you would need, as though someone was picking it up for the first time, because for one reason or another they haven't been listening for the previous 4 or 5 days.
And this is the sort of thing that Newsnight perhaps would do that the main bulletins wouldn't.
Oh no, the main bulletins would as well. We would
explain what a road was.
We would explain.
Yep.
We would explain what a road was.
Now, this is a book aimed at showing young people what to do. Particularly impressed here with the cross-referencing in the book. Who thought of that?
Well, that was my idea, because it's the young person's Bible. And of course, I realised that if you knew the name of the organisation you were going for, well, then of course you just look it up, and the book is compiled in alphabetical order.
Now, why
but
alphabetical?
Most people, well, I mean alphabetical, because that seemed to me the sensible way to put the book into some
could have done
kind
it,
of order.
I suppose, in the way of the letters which come up most commonly.
Well, no, I mean, we're all used to working with dictionaries and thesauruses and even telephone directories, and alphabetical order is, a perfectly natural way of doing things.
I suppose we take it for granted, but is it?
Oh, yes, I think so. Except, and this is why I put in the different categories that you're talking about, except when you don't know the name of the organisations offering the opportunity that you as a young person might want.
Hence the cross-referencing.
Hence the cross-referencing, a special category section. So it's very easy and quick for you to get to those opportunities.
And nail them down in a kill.
Sure.
Now, could you just take us through the cross-referencing system and how exactly it works?
All right. Well, let's take a general area of interest.
Photography.
Okay. Photography. You would probably home in on. Let me just have a look. Yeah. You would. It could be sport and leisure. Well, let me just test it. Okay. Well, first of all, you would
look under F.
It may not be an actual photographic organisation. Right, so there's no actual photographic organisation.
Is this cross-referencing now?
Yes, this is the cross-referencing now.
Yep.
It's not under there. It's under...
Something else.
Further educational training and vocational training. I would suspect that if people were looking for a career in photography, that there would be something there. Film and TV, The Way In.
No.
197.
And this is cross-referencing now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep, brilliant.
I mean, this is the whole point, that
it doesn't
there are
work.
500 organisations represented here, and
it doesn't work.
Some of them are quite wide in their embrace, in their remit.
And the great thing actually is that while you're using the cross-referencing system, you can skim through and find out about things that you didn't actually know about. Kibbutz
that's
Volunteer,
right.
Ockenden Venture, I see here, the Sean Ryder Foundation.
Sure.
That might be quite fun for young people, I suppose.
Yeah, sure.
Now, with this book, you are vying for attention in the mind of youngsters. How do you feel about the fact that you are taking on, for example, the new wave of cartoons?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's a matter of taking them on. I think it's a matter of because hopefully it won't be a choice for youngsters between the new wave of cartoons and my book.
I'm wondering what about this book is going to lead them in your direction when they are drip-fed, some may say, by the Baby Killers, MR Spaz Christ, or MTV's Black Transvestite Gangster Dogs.
Well, I think hopefully when they've finished with all that kind of stuff, which I suspect some of them do very quickly, certainly the kind of youngsters I'm talking about, that they would actually get out there and be aware that this book is around. That's the key, actual awareness.
Well, that's great. These books are doing the rounds, but against that, you have thousands of kids turning up to see comedians like Homicide Cocker, whose act involves inflating life rafts inside dead dogs.
I mean, you clearly get an enormous kick out of talking about all this. If I said to you McDonald's, what would that bring to mind?
Fast food.
Right, and so lots of kids go in there. Well, I can tell you...
Do they?
Well, or their parents, and all their parents.
And all their parents.
Yeah, and I would, if I were to tell you that the paper mats on the trays that you get whenever you eat in a McDonald's restaurant are going to be turned into advertisements and order forms for this Go For It book. Would I surprise you if I said it'll reach a million customers?
But when I think of McDonald's, say around King's Cross, I think of the best place to go in town to get some.
You would go to King's McDonald's around King's Cross. Well, there are lots of youngsters who come into King's Cross.
I know.
And they're at a bit of a loose end, aren't they? So,
and that's the tragedy. And who knows what they're going to be using the paper trays for. I mean, rolling them up and stuffing them a roach.
But come on, this is a terribly negative point of view that you're adopting, because I would have thought that is exactly and probably the only way to reach these kind of youngsters.
So you could market this book through a pusher who was giving them the whole works, and whilst they gave them their little polythene sachet, he could hand them an order form.
Well, I did say that it would need to be a sensible means of distributing the book. I mean, I find it absolutely incredible that you were actually suggesting that drug pushers ought to be given a copy of this book to actually go out and hand out to youngsters. I mean,
yes, but I'm not saying it should happen.
Well, I
certainly
hope you're not, because if you are, I hope Radio 5 Live wouldn't dream of transmitting it.
Now, one of the beneficiaries of this is Prince's Trust, yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So would you say that Prince is a good nurturer of young talent?
Of course he is.
It's not only Wendy and Lisa, it's millions of others.
It's not only who?
The two little girls.
I'm sorry, who are Wendy and Lisa?
They were beneficiaries of Prince about 1989.
Yes, well, I'm afraid that my memory wouldn't stretch back that far, but
they did very well at the time, I believe.
Yes, well, most of the youngsters who are helped by the Prince's organisations do.
Good.
Chris Morris is defined in no small part by mythology. I remember at Radio 1 it was rumoured that he'd send 6-page faxes calling the management spineless wankers if they threatened to edit his work. He was also alleged to have released helium into a news studio when he worked in local radio, so that the newsreader would sound like a squashed hamster when he read his bulletin. But did this actually happen? Chris's biographer, Lucian Randall, investigated further.
Everyone had heard the legends that he was sacked for talking over the news, or he'd filled a studio with helium. These are great, and you go in there as a biographer, there's this brilliant stuff to get, and then you start thinking about it, and you start talking to people, and they're all going, that absolutely happened. He filled a studio with helium, and the newsreader talked in a squeaky voice, and it was great. And when did that happen? Oh, it didn't happen here. It happened at another studio. So I ended up thinking, well, hang on, did it happen? And then I find myself contacting a friend who works at Great Ormond Street, and saying medically, could you fill the studio with helium? What would happen? And he just said you would end up with a dead newsreader because you can't. So I think it's when I found the team bios for the Day-to-Day, and that's where the stories start. And so these vile slurs on Chris Morris's professionalism seem to have been started by Chris Morris, and around that time, and nobody checked the stories, and you just see them, oh well, he did this, and it just snowballed, and then none of his colleagues want to correct anyone on this. So when the tabloids come a knocking and going, did this happen? They say yeah, and then I think they all get enthused by the spirit of Chris Morris. They go, yeah, not only did that happen, but this happened, and then there's just a maelstrom of unchecked fantasy.
For the final episode of the first series of Blue Jam, Chris had edited the speech that the Archbishop of Canterbury made at the funeral of Princess Diana, so it sounded like he'd said despicable things about the royal family. Chris's former boss, Matthew Bannister, had vetoed the item. The story goes that Chris decided to put it out regardless, and someone had to fade it out while it was going live to air to prevent it causing offence. But Matthew has his doubts.
I know that there is a tape now in existence where that programme starts and gets going, and then the Archbishop's speech begins and then is faded out. I don't believe that was ever broadcast, because I think, A, I would have known about it, because somebody would have drawn it to my attention, and B, if it had been faded out in that way, somebody would have had to be there who knew that I'd banned that from being broadcast, and it would have just been a studio manager on shift playing out the programme, and they wouldn't have known that part of the programme should be faded out. So I think the most plausible explanation is that Chris Morris has circulated a version of the tape with that bit faded out, or at some point put together a version of the tape with that bit faded out as a kind of two fingers to me.
There are so many conflicting stories. It's difficult to be sure exactly where reality ends and legend begins. There are certainly people at the BBC who maintain that the Archbishop sketch was broadcast and faded out by a sharp-eared studio manager. Either way, the fact that these stories are still circulating is testimony to Chris's great cunning.